The Rebbe starts off the Sikha by saying we know how accurate and precise Rashi always is in his Pirush. And we know that one of the things is that Rashi will not repeat his Pirush unless there's a real need for it, especially when Psukim are very close to each other. So the Rebbe is dealing in this Sikha with two Rashis that seem to be saying exactly the same thing in our Parsha. The first pasuk is V'shalachti lofanecha malach. Hashem says, I'm going to send a malach in front of you. I'm going to chase out the Knani, the Amoiri, the Chiti, the Prizi, the Chivi, and the Yevusi. Rashi quotes the words V'geirashti as a Knani and says, Shisha Umoy saying these are 6 nations because V'hagirgoshi, and the Girgoshi stood up and ran and left by themselves. A later pasuk in the parsha, the pasuk says, "Hineni goyrish mipanecha," I'm going to chase away Esahamoiri v'Haknani, etc. Rashi quotes the words Esahamoiri and explains there are 6 nations here. Vav umois yeshkan, because Ki Girgoshi amadu panim b'pneim got up and left. Says the Rebbe, it's not understood. Why is Rashi repeating the same thing twice? So there are Mefarshim that say that the reason Rashi is repeating this a second time is because in the first pasuk was speaking about a situation where Hashem would be sending a malach in front of the Yidden. In the second pasuk was speaking about Hashem himself eventually saying that he would lead the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi tells us, nevertheless, there's no difference, and even now, it's still going to be that the 6 nations you're going to have to fight yourself. Only the 7th nation is going to be leaving by themselves. But the Rebbe says this is problematic. First of all, Rashi doesn't mention anything, this chidush, that in other words, the main point seemingly then is that the 6 nations you're still going to have to fight. Rashi doesn't mention that part at all. Rashi is only mentioning that which is obvious anyways, that the Girgoshi is going to leave by themselves. Now, if in the previous pasuk when a Malach is leading the Yidden, the Girgoshi would be leaving by themselves, how much more so if the Yidden are being led by Hashem himself? Furthermore, the Rebbe says, if our pasuk would be mainly focused on the idea that the Yidden are going to have to fight the Goyim, and Hashem is going to help them, etc., so then we can understand that we're saying that nevertheless, even though Hashem is with you, you're still going to have to deal with 6 of the nations. But it seems to be that the pasuk is trying to emphasize a better way of dealing with the Goyim. The pasuk says, I'm going to chase them away. And now, if the pasuk seems to be trying to bring out the greatness of what's going to happen, this Pirush of Rashi then seems to be in contradiction to this, by saying, no, the 6 nations are still going to stay, you're still going to have to deal with them. The Rebbe says, furthermore, if Rashi finds it necessary to tell us why the pasuk mentions 6 nations and not 7 nations, Rashi should have done this earlier. Twice in Parsha Shmois do we have already decided that 6 nations are being mentioned and not Girgoshi. And in Parsha Mishpatim we also have the same thing. So what's going on? Why over here suddenly does Rashi feel it necessary to explain this? The Rebbe says, the one in Parshas Mishpatim we could explain in the following way. In Parshas Mishpatim it says, I'm going to be sending a malach in front of you. Rashi explains that the Yidden are being told over here that eventually they will sin, and therefore a malach is going to be the one that's going to have to lead them. Oh, so this one matches the same pasuk in Parshas Ki Sisa, where it's a malach that's going to be leading them, and only 6 nations are mentioned. So we could say that Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim is relying on that link, so to speak, to the pasuk in Parshas Ki Sisa, because in Parshas Ki Sisa he's going to explain why it's only 6 nations and not the 7th nation, because the 7th nation leaves by themselves. However, the question still remains, what about the 2 times in Parshas Shmois where the pasuk mentions 6 nations and leaves out Girgoshi? And Rashi doesn't say anything. The Rebbe also now goes in contrast to 2 Rashis within Parshas Ki Sisa, a bunch of differences, and rather than discussing the questions over here or the similarities or not similarities, we're going to do this when we go to the Rebbe's explanation. And the Rebbe says, the difference between Parsha Shmois and the Psukim in our Parsha can be explained very simply. In Parsha Shmois, we're actually not dealing with the nations per se of how we're going to get rid of the nations. Parsha Shmois is speaking about the Yidden coming into a beautiful, good land flowing with milk and honey. The pasuk says, I'm going to bring you to the place, a good and spacious land, the place of the Kanani, Chiti, Amoiri, etc. And doesn't mention Girgoshi. So the Rebbe says very simply, we could say in Pshut Shomikra, Girgoshi is not mentioned because that's not part of the best part of Eretz Yisrael that's flowing with milk and honey. And that's why it's not mentioned in those 2 psukim in Parsha Shmois, which are describing the land. But of course, when it comes to our Parsha, where we're describing the nations themselves being driven out of the land, and only 6 nations are mentioned, so the question is what's happening with the 7th, so Rashi has to explain it. And now to the differences between these 2 psukim themselves and why Rashi has to repeat himself. There's a big difference, says the Rebbe. In the first pasuk, we're actually speaking about how Hashem is going to be dealing with the nations, how he's going to be chasing away the nations. So the question right away becomes, why are we only dealing with 6 nations? What's going to happen with the 7th nation? So Rashi says, because the 7th nation got up and left by themselves. when the second pasuk in Parshas Sisa is not really dealing with this idea itself of the nations being driven away. It's really coming in continuation to something else. The pasuk is saying, Shmar L'cha, you should listen to and guard everything that I'm commanding you. There are certain tzivuyim, certain commands of what the Yidden need to do in connection to these goyim, not to make covenants with them, to break down their mizbechos, etc., etc., etc. And the pasuk mentions 6 nations. So then the question is, what about the 7th nation? Don't we have to deal the same way with the things of the 7th nation as well? Not to make a covenant with them, etc., etc.? And this is why Rashi comes along and says, Vav umis yeshkan. The Rebbe is translating yeshkan, not that in the pasuk there are 6 nations. There's practically only 6 nations in Eretz Yisrael, living in Eretz Yisrael right now, and therefore, practically, these mitzvahs are not going to apply with the Gergashi, because practically they had left already. The Rebbe says this will explain why Rashi in the second Rashi uses the term not as in the first Rashi, viha Gergashi, and the Gergashi left, but Rashi says ki ha Gergashi, because the Gergashi left. In other words, these mitzvahs are practically not applying to them because they have left Eretz Yisrael already. Another difference, says the Rebbe, is that in the first Rashi said, Amad upanam epnei me'elav, they left on their own. Here, in the second time, Rashi doesn't say on their own because it's not relevant. It doesn't matter how they left. The bottom line is they're not inhabitants of the land right now. Then these ideas, these prohibitions and the mitzvahs are practically not relevant in how to deal with them. The Rebbe says from here we take out something very interesting in halacha as well as far as this Rashi is concerned. Gergashi leaves Eretz Yisrael. They're not there when the Yidden are coming into Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, do these mitzvahs apply to Gergashi if let's say they come back to Eretz Yisrael? Or if some of them have stayed in Eretz Yisrael, or whatever, if they stayed in Eretz Yisrael, we'll see later. But anyways, the point is, what about if they come back to Eretz Yisrael? Is it about the time that Eden came into Eretz Yisrael? That's the deciding factor. And the bottom line is they weren't living there then. Or when Hashem gave the command, they were living in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it does apply to them. From the words of Rashi, which we just explained as meaning Shisha Umas Yesh Kan, there are here right now 6 nations, it implies that it's only because practically there's only 6 nations, so these mitzvahs are going to apply to them practically, but be'etzem, in essence, it does apply to Gergashi as well, theoretically, if they would be here. And as we find later in Chumash Dvarim, that a lot of these mitzvahs say specifically that it applies to all 7 nations, even though technically, again, Gergashi wasn't there at the time when the Yidden came in. The Rebbe now turns to the Chassidus in this Rashi. And the Rebbe says like this, when we look at the 2 expressions in Rashi, the first Rashi where it says that there's 6 nations, and what about Gergashi? And the Gergashi left by themselves. In the second Rashi it says ki, because the Gergashi got up and left from before them. So the Rebbe says it seems to be that when Gergashi leaves, it seems to be describing, it's in 2 different times. In the first Rashi, it sounds, the 6 nations are gone, Viha Gergashi and the Gergashi left by themselves, it sounds like it's after the 6 nations. In the second Rashi, where it says there's 6 nations, because Gergashi left, it sounds like Gergashi left even earlier than the 6 nations. So the Rebbe is going to explain this now in Avodas Hashem. We know Chassidus explains that the 7 nations correspond to the 7 attributes, the 7 emotional faculties within a person. And the chesed and gevura, etc., of klipa, which we have to refine. These are the ones that stand in contrast to the ones of kedusha. Knani is chesed of klipa, and so on and so forth. We need to conquer, and we need to elevate our 7 midos. Sfarim explain that Gergashi, that goes away by themselves, is referring to malchus of klipa. And what does it mean that it leaves by itself? That once we dealt with the first 6 midos, then malchus is gone automatically. Why? Malchus is the idea of machshava dibur u'maisa, the practical part, thought, speech, and action. If we get rid of our midos, for example, the ava to negative things, the love to negative things, the taivas to negative things, if we get rid of the gevura, the kas, anger, etc., then automatically there's no room for thought, speech, and action of negative things. Because a person is going to do an act according to his feelings and his emotions. So this is one way how we go, which is first you deal with the 6 midos, and then automatically the malchus, which is machshava dibur u'maisa, is gone. But then there's another way. We may have not dealt yet with our midos, like the Beinoni and Tanya didn't get rid of his Yetzer Hara yet, but he conquers his Yetzer Hara, at least in the areas of machshava dibur u'maisa, thought, speech, and action. Says the Rebbe, this is the differences between these 2 Rashis. The first Rashi is speaking about the normal order of going into Eretz Yisrael, the conquering of the 7 nations. So the Seder is, first you deal with the 6 nations, and then as Rashi says, V'ha-Girgoshi, and the Girgoshi will then be gone automatically after that. However, the second Rashi, which is in other words, the Machshava Dibur U'Mais will be gone automatically if you dealt with the Midos. The second Rashi is speaking about not of how the order of officially going into Eretz Yisrael, but rather what's the command to the Yid, practically, and how he has to deal. A person not necessarily can wait till he's going to deal with all of the midos. The most important thing is Maisa, and therefore he's being told immediately. There has to be the idea of getting rid of the Gergoshi as a result of the Kedusha of the Nefesh Alikis. As a result of the Kedusha of the Yid and the Gergoshi are just going to be gone. You have to, the Machshava Dibur U'Mais will be taken care of. In other words, this is the first thing the Yid has to deal with his Kedusha, even if he didn't deal yet with the other midos. The Rebbe says by doing the avodah in all of our midos and in all of these inyanim, this is the proper preparation we're going to conquer. Not only the land of 7 nations, but when Mashiach comes, we're going to have the land of all 10 nations corresponding to all the 10 spheroids. And this will, of course, be Begula Mitzvah Shlema. Take it from a Yad Mamash.